So, when did counseling stop being about problem solving? Well, not anymore. Introducing solution-focused counseling with the unlicensed counselor. And now, here's your host, Steve Moak.
Well, hello and welcome. Welcome to another episode of The Unlicensed Counselor. My name is Steve Moak. I am the Unlicensed Counselor. And as always, so grateful to be here on another beautiful, sunny Scottsdale, Arizona day. Love this time of year. I'm excited. There's enthusiasm in the air here in studio as I'm grateful to have a guest, friend, co-founder in studio with me as well. Jeff Taylor is going to be joining us as well today to talk on some really interesting topics. We're going to touch on his story. We're going to touch on criminal justice. We're going to touch on homelessness. We're going to touch on a lot of different things that we haven't really discussed here on the podcast. So, Jeff, thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of your day and joining us. I look forward to digging into this.
It's a pleasure. Always good to see you, Steve.
Thank you. And before we jump into this, because I am excited to get to this topic today, it's just I have really interesting friends with really interesting stories, and I hope that some of this is really going to land with our audience out there and get them thinking. But before we do all that, I always want to start by saying thank you to our sponsor, ShareTech. Look, ShareTech is the leading drug and alcohol screen for at-home detection, right? It is performed by a lab. It is the most comprehensive test available on the market. This is not one of those dipsticky type cups that you order on Amazon or CVS or Walmart where you look into the plastic cup and hope that strip that you can read it and see if there's THC or cocaine or something. The ShareTech test actually detects for over 100 substances. That includes things like alcohol. That includes things like kratom, things that people use very often that many people don't know are really mind-altering drugs as well, too, especially kratom. And I want to do a whole episode on kratom because that's just a nasty thing that's sold over the counter as well, too. And I personally have some friends that are addicted to that right now. And it's ugly stuff. So if you're in the market for an at-home drug or alcohol screen, please go to our friends at ShareTech, ShareTek, and pick up one of those drug and alcohol screens as well, too. Now, if you've been listening to the show for any period of time, you know that I'm very passionate about youth drug abuse prevention. That's why Jeff, myself, Seth, who was just on a previous show, another gentleman named Hugh Hallman, co-founded an organization called the Coalition for Youth Drug Abuse Prevention. That's a mouthful, but our website is not. Go to thestopstartshere.org. Follow us. You're going to find some really edgy, bold, interesting content. Our prevention approach is to use social media to meet the kids where they're at, right? I think the school assemblies are great, but what we need to do is live and get messaging that is saturated to them over the course of a year, not just over 1 hour for 1 year. Go to thestopstartshere.org. You're going to find videos. You're going to find content that we're shooting, even many movies that we've put together. And really, it's kind of bold, edgy stuff around youth drug prevention. So, all right, good stuff. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining the show today. Really appreciate it. When I asked you to come on, I said, I'd really like to dig into kind of the homeless topic. It's not something I know a ton about. I know you have firsthand knowledge of that. So maybe if we explain, how you became an expert really in this, kind of the state of what homelessness looks like in the state of Arizona, the West Coast, nationally, whatever you have thoughts on, how folks got there, and then maybe what are some solutions, or if we know a loved one who maybe is struggling with this, how can we make a difference? I know that's a lot of things, but let's just start at the beginning.
Well, I would start with homelessness is very broad. And when you hear homelessness, it really encompasses a lot of different populations that have different needs, and they became homeless for different reasons. So I'm just going to mention the two arenas that we need to define, and then move on to chronically homeless people. And those are people that you see that are very visible, that are living in encampments. And it's been really, all over the news in the last 2 or 3 years. Really started in San Francisco, but all up and down the coast where I've been on the nonprofit that I serve on their Western United States board, big homeless provider. And so I've been to Oregon. I haven't been to Seattle, but we've all seen what's going on in Seattle. So that's the chronically homeless, people living in encampments. But before we get into that, there are people that are getting priced out of apartments. And here in Arizona, apartment rents have gone up 60, 70% in the last 5 years. So when you're talking about what I call the people that are on fixed incomes, mainly the elderly or people with developmental that they are disabled, so they're on a fixed income.
Got it.
So each time they go and they're housed, 5 years ago, and each time they go and renew their lease is up. Their lease has increased on monthly basis $200, $300, $400, and they get to the point where they cannot afford on their fixed income. To give an example, I know of a true affordable housing project here in town. It is substantial. They have 2 mid-rise affordable housing. This organization takes 30% of whatever your fixed income is, and that is what they charge for your own apartment. So if you have a $100, disability check every month, then they take $300, and that gets you your own apartment and also 3 meals a day, 365 days a year. True affordable housing, okay? And there is a 29-month waiting list.
Wow.
And there are 300 units.
Wow.
29-month waiting list. So they mainly deal with the second population that I'll talk about, and that is the elderly. They are, again, on a Social Security.
Sure.
These are people that have worked their whole lives, and yet they find themselves facing homelessness. My phone rings all the time with this population, and the availability for affordable housing is really lacking. So Housing First works for those two populations, the working poor and then people that have been priced out of an apartment that are on a fixed income that are basically the elderly. These are people with not drug problems, without or maybe they have low mental health, but that's not the reason why they're in this situation.
I'm glad you kind of took this approach, because when and maybe it's the media or just my lack of knowledge on the situation, I immediately go to that chronic homeless as that picture in my mind. And so I'm glad you're kind of breaking it out into 2 different buckets. It makes a lot of sense. I just candidly didn't really think about it that way.
So what we'll talk about on your show, and what really is the focus of your message on this show, is the chronically homeless. And those are people that are living on the streets, living in encampments that are very visible. People that are panhandling on street corners, people that are hanging around, light rail routes or public transportation in the cities. They'll ride that to get out of the elements. Then those may stop in the middle of the night. And so the hot spots are where these lines end, where a bus line ends or where a light rail ends. And then you get encampments surrounding that until, public transportation opens up the next morning. So the chronically homeless, we need to call it what it is. And what it is untreated drug addiction, untreated mental illness, or some combination of both. And that is 99% of your chronically homeless that are visible on the street corner. We have families that are homeless, but they're not visible. You may have a single mother that is homeless, but they're not real visible like this. It is not safe for them to be in a homeless encampment. These are very, very dangerous arenas in which to hang around. You have desperate people doing desperate things. And they are really hitting us all in organized retail theft, which we all pay for.
Right.
We've all seen the videos, of organized retail theft. California, through a ballot initiative, which means it was put to the vote of the public, and they basically approved that, I believe it's $950, that it drops to a misdemeanor, and it's not an arrestable offense, I think, but it's a civil penalty where you're basically given a ticket.
I think that means you legalize shoplifting.
Right.
Right?
And we have people that are actually going into retail establishments with a calculator to make sure that they're under the $950. And they'll actually go up and ask the manager of the store, does the $950 include tax?
Wow.
So it just opened the door for criminal behavior. And a Housing First model for this population has proven time to time again to be extremely expensive and a disaster.
So, but I think people, you always hear about housing. Now, I understand it for kind of the first population that you mentioned about. But it always gets attached to the chronically homeless. It's like, if we can just get them, a bed and a house and a place. But I think that, you are an expert in this field, given the work that you do. That doesn't seem to be the solution, or one that works. They don't want the bed.
What they need, though, they need shelter, because they're not going to go to treatment if they're homeless.
Okay,
they're not going to pick themselves up off the streets and, roll up their sleeping bag and fold up their tent and go to an outpatient treatment facility. So what is needed is residential drug treatment. So basically, you are housed, you are fed, and you are engaged in behavioral health. And the 28-day program just doesn't work for this. People are just really getting their senses back after 28 days. So we need long-term residential treatment, and it can step down to where people are actually still engaged in treatment and yet going and getting behavioral health in the evenings. So that's the most important part. I call it kind of transitioning out of residential homeless.
Yeah.
And that they're practicing their recovery. So I, again, like to be simple. So you learn, that is in treatment. You practice, that is transition. And then you become, where you're launched. And you are, a productive member of society. And you're still treating your addiction by going to 12-step meetings or hanging around people that, are clean and sober. When I first got into recovery, I thought I wasn't going to have any more fun. I was a young person, and I was going to concerts and going to parties and going to the clubs and the bars, and boy, any of those arenas were not going to be fun. Well, I learned that if I hang around sober people, which I do today, then we go to concerts and we do all the things that young people used to do, only we just don't get loaded, and we have a better time.
Right, and remember it.
And it's enjoyable. I mean, I've been to Metallica concerts and Megadeth concerts,
right,
and the Eagles concerts, and they're really, really enjoyable. But that was a fear of mine, is that they wouldn't be. That the fun's over,
right,
and yet here I am. But as you mentioned, I did end up homeless, but I didn't start there. So when you look out and you see people that are, panhandling, or people that are living in a tent, or just walking down the street that are obviously homeless, that's not how they started off. It took a long time to spiral there. This is somebody's daughter, somebody's son, somebody's father that ended up there, but that's not the beginning of their journey.
I mean, if people want to hear a little bit more about Jeff's story, if you go to the last week's episode, you actually hear a little bit. I mean, Jeff was a collegiate athlete, a D1 athlete at the University of Arizona, as a college football player, and kind of his road and how we got there. I don't know if we need to go all the way down that again, but what I find so fascinating about you is just aesthetically, when you look at it, it's like there's no way, that I would look and think that this person was ever homeless, or even really, you just look like so well put together. But I think that's what I find interesting, that, just because what you look like doesn't mean that somebody doesn't have all this stuff behind them.
And it used to be the Skid Row bum,
Right.
Now people say, you don't look like a homeless drug addict. And I'm like, yes, I do. Because there are many young people out there that are coming from good families, as I did.
Right.
And I was just as homeless as the next guy. And just to make it kind of a short story on how I spiraled down to homelessness, is that you want to hang around people that are worse off than you are, so I can feel better, right? So I was going to the clubs, and then people would go home at 10 o'clock, and I'm like, why is everybody going home? So I would stay with the ones that are obviously inebriated,
right,
but I wasn't as bad as they were.
Right.
And I remember driving people home because I wasn't the guy that you babysit. And I thought I was doing that to feel better. It's not that I really wanted to drive them home. I wanted to feel better. Well, then I didn't have money to go to the clubs because I had lost my job. I had lost, at one point, my housing. The last thing to go is really your car. I'd lost relationships with my family and friends. Now I'm getting more and more isolated, so I started hanging around people that were a little lower than me. Yeah. So I actually would hang out at the when you were on unemployment, and that was here in the state of Arizona, Department of Economic Security. So I would hang around Department of Economic Security because there were a bunch of people that didn't have, jobs just like me, but they were worse off than I was, so I would hang around them. And then they were kind of looking for a job, and maybe that's why they were there. Maybe they're getting their unemployment, worked out. And now I'm that person, so I had to hang around somebody lower. So now I'm hanging around people that were, homeless like me, maybe couch hopping. Yep. They still had relationships, and people would let them into your house, and they're not visibly in an encampment yet. So I hung around those people, would couch hop, so I'm not out in the elements. And then that ran out because addiction doesn't stay the same. It gets worse over time. So now I'm hanging around people in homeless encampments because I wasn't as bad as they were. I'm not looking like they do, but I hung around them because it made me feel better. I was better than them, yet I was just as homeless as they were. And then I woke up one day and I saw all these homeless people wanting to hang around me.
Oh boy. Yeah.
felt better
Yeah.
because I was living in a bush.
Wow.
And that's took me a while to get there. I didn't just wake up living in a bush. It was a long and arduous road getting down to the lowest of the low, which is living in a bush. And people look at me and they're like, oh, you lived in a bush? And I'm like, hey, don't judge it. Like, people judge you that you lived in a bush. And I'm like, hey, wait a minute. It was a pretty bitchin' bush. You didn't know it was like any real estate. It was like location, location, location.
Unbelievable.
And I didn't know it was a great bush. I was kind of new to this homeless thing, but when I would leave, other homeless people would move into it.
And they'd steal your bush.
Yeah, which was shade. It can be 115 degrees here in
Right.
Phoenix, and it had a lot of shade. And it was by places like St. Vincent de Paul that, would feed the homeless. It was by legal services, which we'll get into here in a little bit on the legal aspect. And so I was being arrested for being homeless.
Right.
Homeless was criminalized. Here in the state of Arizona. If you're out by ASU, which is in the city of Tempe, if you sit on the sidewalk and a police officer asks you to move and you don't, you can be arrested for sitting on a sidewalk.
Wow.
Because that was their way of managing chronic homelessness.
Right.
So now I'm going to jail. And they don't really hold on to you for a misdemeanor in jail. So I was one of those catch and release guys. So I'd get arrested, spend the night in jail, I'd see an initial appearance judge, and then he would let me go. And actually, it was kind of a rest for me. Because then, I had actually, some place to sleep, even though it was, for only one night, and they would usually feed you something, and then I would be released. And it was like, I didn't really mind getting arrested because I needed a rest.
Wow.
And I was starving. And so I could get food and
Right.
get a night's sleep
Makes
and then
sense.
back out into the streets. So how is it that I got from living in basically my own little encampment into recovery? Addicts understand consequences. Right now, we have lifted the consequences, the legal consequences of criminal behaviors that we all pay for as a society. People that are driving under the influence, people that are stealing from retail establishments, violence that we see on the streets. Let's talk about, the violence of a desperate homeless person that is in, let's say, a convenience store, and he's trying to leave, and somebody's not going to put up with that, who's a hardworking individual, and they try to stop them, and then you've got a violent situation. Right. Now, if I go to that person that is doing drug-motivated crime, I call it, then offer them a treatment bed that is free and it is available today, they won't go.
Why?
Because there's no consequence. Why would they? Because we have now kind of the perfect storm for homelessness. And that is, here in the state of Arizona in 2018, our governor very wisely issued a state of emergency for a pharmaceutical addictive substance in a pill called OxyContin.
Yep.
And we know about OxyContin, and that's what really kicked off, addiction in this country. It was a pharmaceutical, it was no longer a street drug, and that pill was $1 a milligram, and there were different milligram pills, but most of them were 40 or 60 milligram OxyContin pills.
40 or $60 a
So it was
shot.
$1 a milligram,
Okay.
40 or $60 a pill, and you would need 6 or 7 pills a day, depending on your
Okay.
level of addiction.
That's a couple $100.
Yeah, that's a lot of work, and there were consequences, meaning you're getting arrested and you're being put in jail. And then we really ramped up diversion programs, and the diversion programs were limited, on the charges, as they should be. You don't want to go too far on the charges to get into the violent realm, because then you have a victim. You also have a victim when you're doing retail theft, but part of like a well-run diversion program like here in Maricopa County, which encompasses Phoenix, is that you've got to pay back victims. You have to sign a letter that you have written out admitting guilt to your crime that can be used against you in the future, but we are going to remove you for now. We're going to put your case on hold, but there's a consequence of, if you do not take the treatment pathway that we outline for you, then we're going to use your letter, which is basically a confession, and we're going to prosecute you on the crime that you committed, and you're going to go to jail or to prison, depending on the level of crime that you're doing. That's a consequence.
It seems reasonable.
Hanging over the person's head.
Right.
So that's what happened to me. Before diversion was even a word. We're talking about the mid-'90s.
You pioneered diversions, kind of.
It was, I believe it was God's intervention because it was not even a word back then, but I had a very wise judge that identified that he looked at my criminal history, and I'd never been in trouble in my life until my early 30s, and he's like, this kid, he's a high-functioning guy. He was very successful, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 boom. Now, I never had a drug charge. I never had a drug possession charge. I never had a DUI. Not that I didn't deserve one,
Sure.
but I was never charged with any of those crimes. So my addiction was hidden in my criminal justice. But the wise judge said, this guy's doing this because he is a drug
Is
addict.
it drug motivated or? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
So he offered me that pathway to treatment, and it was long-term residential treatment. But he didn't just drop the charge. What he did was he hung that over my head. He said, Mr. Taylor, if you are back in front of me and you do not complete this treatment program, then you're going to be back in my court, and I am going to sentence you to a term of imprisonment. And at that time, my plea agreement was 4 to 6 years in prison. That's a consequence.
That's a serious consequence.
Right.
Did that get your attention? Did that wake you up?
You bet.
I would think so.
The consequence did.
Right.
I was offered treatment before I had really any sort of problems with the criminal justice system, and I didn't go.
So treatment with no kind of looming consequences was just,
Not for this population.
got it.
Now, maybe it might have been something that I would have considered earlier on in my spiral.
Before you progressed. That makes a ton of sense.
So we're taking, the cartels they're very good at what they do. More powerful, more addictive, less cost. And that is really something we've never really faced. Drugs used to be, narcotic drugs were very expensive. I had a $200-300 a day narcotics, addiction, and that required a lot of work. Nowadays, you can stand on a street corner because that $60, $50, whatever dollar pill will average it out at $50 a pill, and you need many of them, $200 to $300 a day. Now that same pill in potency, in fentanyl, which is an illegally produced drug in other countries that are imported to this country and sold on the streets, that pill has gone from $50 a pill down to $1 a pill.
I don't think people realize that. I think they just hear fentanyl and the cartels and stuff, and they just kind of think that. But that is so cheap and it's probably why it somewhat explains all the panhandling that you see. I think that's not just in this state. I think that's everywhere now, because you get $50 or $100 and you are set now. I mean, you are set to
Not
get
even.
high.
You can stand on a street corner with a scribbled sign on a cardboard box that says, God bless, please help, and raise $20 a day and be a full-blown, what we would have called a heroin addict.
Right.
It used to be $200, $300, even $400
Are people
a day.
even using heroin anymore? I mean, is that even a thing?
It's been I was talking to a police officer the other day, and they actually made a bust where there were several types of drugs in the car. They were dealers, and they found heroin, and they're like, God, we haven't seen this in over a
Old
year.
school.
Yeah,
Right.
we haven't seen heroin, and this is a police officer that
Right.
does narcotics busts all the time. So fentanyl has replaced heroin, and it is the smuggler's dream. So fentanyl is really made out of a very concentrated pharmaceutical powder called carfentanil, and carfentanil is where you see the picture
The little
of the little
dots.
like a little granule of sand that's a lethal dose. Now, in a and I had a member of the DEA explain this to me, who deals with this at our border, 4-inch by 4-inch box that they're flying over the border in drones.
Drones now.
And there's 250,000 doses in that box. We are being flooded.
Flooded.
And that's how it's very dangerous, because people that don't know how to dilute that
Right.
into something that is not going to kill people, that's how we have people that are dying on the streets. 112,000, I think, that we heard on your last show.
Yeah, overdoses annually.
Annually, which is a massive amount, mainly young people, a massive amount of people that are expiring every year needlessly. 100% preventable. Drug addiction and drug overdose death is 100% preventable.
So then now we've got, it seems like encampments, it used to just be Skid Row. Like that was the one that I knew about growing up. Now it seems like Skid Rows are everywhere. There are encampments. We had one called the Zone here in Arizona. So why is everybody just congregate in order to deal drugs or to? I don't understand how that started happening. Why we haven't started doing anything. I guess I'm just naive to that. Do you have any more insight?
Well, misery loves company, and that's what occurred. And usually these encampments will pop up where they can be fed.
Okay.
So it's a magnet to just feed people without other services.
It's
okay
actual
to feed
food,
people.
like so. Okay, got it.
Like organized feeding programs.
Got it.
And one of them is St. Vincent de Paul, who I love St. Vincent de Paul. Okay, they need some help. Okay, their mission is to combat hunger for the least among us. What a great mission, right? But without the other really organizations that need to surround them, then you just bring people into that community and they get fed and they walk out of being fed with the same drug problem or mental illness that they walked in with. So that's a part of it. They need some help. They need other behavioral services that are surrounding that. And still, it's very difficult to move people on from living on the streets into a residential high barrier, where you have to have sobriety, where it's verified in sobriety. You are drug tested. That's too big of a leap. But the best pathway I know is to start enforcing the law. So people then push back, and I'm in public policy, and I'm down at our Capitol, and I work a little bit in Texas and a little bit in Washington, D.C. on solutions to our chronic homeless problem. And the solutions to me, the best solution to me, is we've got to start enforcing the law. Well, then I get pushback that you're outlawing homelessness. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I am outlawing drug dealing. I am outlawing assaults. I am outlawing aggravated assault, which is felony assault.
Got it.
I am outlawing sexual assault on women. Women are being sexually assaulted try to be a woman
I can't.
and be in a chronically homeless situation.
How dangerous it has to be.
We need to protect these people from themselves a lot of times, but enforce the law. Addicts understand consequences, make it hurt. I sat in a jail cell for 6 months. Now we're going to, we're going to fill up some jails, but we're going to reduce recidivism. So I'm no genius. Wrote a law here in the state of Arizona. I work in public policy, and I wrote a law way back in 2002. And this is just modeled after my own life. And what this law does is it takes people that are already sentenced to prison. Okay, we're not into sentencing reform.
Sure.
We're into rewarding good behavior in a prison. And as a reward, under certain charges again, then that person is offered a 90-day early release into a behavioral health pathway.
Like a step down.
Right.
Yeah.
But not just a transition, it's a behavioral health pathway. We have people in our prisons. I think our last exit assessment by Arizona Department of Corrections on people that are being released from prison is that 82% had a behavioral health problem that is untreated.
Okay.
So we need to combine the both. And why I say combining is consequence plus help. If you just have a consequence, people are going to get out with the same drug problem they were arrested with. Only when I was being arrested and I was put in to, different county jails, and I spent some time in Arizona Department of Corrections, is I got to network with a bunch of other people that were just like me. I know how to cook crystal methamphetamine 4 different ways. And I didn't even use the drug.
I shouldn't laugh.
I mean, it doesn't mean
your point.
that I wouldn't use the drug.
Right.
It was just not my drug of choice. So that's the kind of skills that I learned while being incarcerated. And that's not just here in Arizona. It's throughout our criminal justice, prisons, federally and state-run prisons and jails throughout the country. So it's not an Arizona problem. It's a problem throughout the country. So what if we were to do this? People are going to suffer consequences. You broke the law. You have a victim. And we're going to reward good behavior in the prison, meaning if you're going to, some of your treatment classes, because you can't force anybody to do anything in a prison. A lot of people are offered, behavioral health help, and they're just like, I'm not going to do it. You can't force somebody in.
Right.
But a lot of people with an incentive and an early release, then they go. But we measure that in the prison. You can't, have any violent acts in the prison. And people are told this in the beginning. So when you have less, like drug use in the prison, less violence in the prison, it makes it for a safer community for the people that are incarcerated, but also for the guards that work there, because they're the ones that have to manage the violence. And whenever drugs get into a prison yard, then violence increases. Number one reason for inmate-to-inmate violence is that you owe somebody.
Is that really it?
Number one reason.
I didn't know that.
And that means that you probably borrowed, you borrowed drugs.
Okay.
You were given drugs on credit, you can't pay it back, and that causes violence. So whenever drugs hit a yard, and it's very difficult to keep drugs out of a prison, it's been getting into prisons, it just finds a way. It's kind of like the first Jurassic Park. Life found a way. Drugs find a way,
It makes sense, right?
Right. So this program has released, since 2003, when it became law, 25,000 people 90 days early.
Okay.
Into the behavioral health pathway. And how you measure the success of any correctional system is your recidivism rate. How many people go back?
Coming back.
And I remember working with our county attorney. I love this man. His name is Bill Montgomery. Yeah. He's basically the top cop in Maricopa County. He's the prosecutor, elected a prosecutor. And he and I worked on this and said, you know what? If we are reducing recidivism equals crime, because you're reoffending.
Right.
If we can reduce recidivism, A, we're going to save money because they're not going back to prison. B, we're going to make it a safer community because reduction in recidivism is a reduction in crime. And then we're making it safer in the prison. It's a win-win-win.
All around.
And if you're given this pathway to treatment and you violate this, then guess what? There's another consequence. Maybe treatment works the second time or third time. Treatment communities don't give up on people. I like to think that God never gave up on me. He just kept at it until I finally got it.
So are we, this all makes too much sense. Like why if it's working here, is it working other places? Are they just not doing this? Why aren't we kind of taking this approach at more of a national level? Or maybe we are and I just don't know about it.
I would love to go to the governors in this country and sit down with the governor and say, depending on your size of your prison system, because we have different populations in different states, but let's use a percentage and just say, let's say that I could decrease your dependency on your prison beds by 20% and make it a safer community in the prison and save a ton of money in your reincarceration costs and make a safer community. Would you do it? And they would go, of course they would do it. I mean, who would say no to that?
It's not possible. It's political suicide, if you would, right?
And it's getting easier.
Right.
It was very difficult in the beginning.
And we're talking nonviolent folks, too. So I just don't want people to think that, if you've done, because I want those people locked away, right? If you've hurt me or my daughter or you murdered this is nonviolent stuff that we're talking about.
Well, we increased it to certain violent, because it's so popular in the outcomes that we have people that have drug problems that maybe had a bar fight.
Okay, that's reasonable.
And when we were younger, a bar fight, the police would show up and they would say, you know what, you're going to go that way. You're going to go that way. Do you want to press charges? And usually it's like, no, you know what, we're just going to separate you two and you just go home and there were no charges, right? Now, it's kind of somebody's going to jail. And now you have a violent criminal history. So, something like a bar fight, what we call assault, a simple assault, which in, a lot of states is a misdemeanor. And then we even stretched it a little bit up to felony assault, which is, where usually somebody is harmed. You're going to have a victim. But the argument is, are we going to not reward good behavior, hold on to this individual for 90 days, and not give them any help?
Okay.
Or are we going to reward good behavior, get them out 90 days earlier, which is about $6,000 just on the 90-day early release, just to release them 90 days early.
That's the savings?
About $6,000. And that's pretty consistent throughout the states. And give them a lot of help on the back end. So I believe that there's people that are never going to get out of prison on some of the of the crimes that you mentioned.
Right.
Murders, multiple rapes, child molestation.
Good. Sorry.
They are long-term people, even if they do get out. And when they do get out, oftentimes they're very old people. And as you get older, you have a less propensity to commit a violent crime. I concentrate on the people that maybe got into a bar fight because they were drunk.
Yeah. That makes total sense.
We all know people that are not very violent people until they get a snootful, and then all of a sudden they're a different person. People just become, some people, not all, some people become more violent. So I believe that the key is that, A, we treat people like the human being they are and offer them this pathway, but it's really up to you. It's up to you to go to your classes in prison. It's up to you to stay out of trouble. It's up to you to not use drugs on a prison yard. And that's what addicts do. They use drugs on a prison yard. So we adjusted the law that you can't have a positive drug test in the 6 months prior to your release.
Makes sense.
So it's kind of asking too much. You're feeling miserable. You just want to feel better. Drugs hit the yard, and then you get, that's what addicts do.
Yeah.
I mean, fish swim, birds fly, addicts use drugs.
I mean, you and I are living proof of that, right? I mean, that's kind of what goes along with it. Well, this is good stuff. We got a few minutes left. I mean, some closing thoughts on this, and maybe some thoughts around if you know a loved one or have a loved one who's maybe going through or experiencing homelessness or is trending that way. Is there anything that you could do? I hear the consequences plus help. I love that. That makes sense. It seems reasonable. Any other thoughts to kind of put a bow on this as we're kind of coming to an end here?
So my parents, I never really realized how hard this was on my parents because I just disappeared, into the drug world. They didn't know where I was. They knew that I wouldn't go into treatment because they had offered me treatment. And so I had really given up one day. I'd had enough, and I called them up and I said, hey, I'm coming home. And I can just imagine what that was like on the other end of the phone. So do not enable your children. Do not enable them because you will enable them into the grave. And people say, well, they're living on the streets. And I'm like, children are dying in their beds in their house.
But I mean, that's paying their cell phone bill, giving them money. That's the enabling we're talking about here, folks.
And just what you want to do as a parent, how God designed us as a parent is to make sure your children are safe and fed and that you care for them, this is hard to do. So how you are wired oftentimes is the exact opposite of what you should be doing with your children.
Yeah.
Back to my parents. So when I got home, they left in a hurry. I mean, there was food in the microwave, like fans are still going, the house is all locked up. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking, they didn't have enough food. They went to the store so they can feed and clothe and take care of me for a while, like parents are wired to do. Well, my parents are black belts in tough love, okay? They left. They were not going to let me in the house. They left. And so I'm waiting and I'm like, I wonder what's going on here. So I came up with a plan. And the plan was, I'm going to break a window, but I'm not going to enter. So now I'm a misdemeanor. I'm a misdemeanor. I knew the law.
Right.
So I'm going to break a window. It's just criminal damage.
Right.
And then the alarm's going to go off. And then the alarm company is going to call my parents. And then they're going to feel sorry for me and come home and feed and clothe me and take care of me for a while. It's not exactly what happened.
Did go down that way?
So the alarm, I broke the window, the alarm went off, the alarm company called my parents called the police, and they came and fed and clothed me and took care of me for a while. I was arrested.
Wow.
By my parents' phone call to the police.
Wow.
And they're like, do you want him arrested? They said, absolutely. Now that was very hard for my parents to do that, to arrest their child.
How do you think they knew how to do that, or that was the right course?
I think they had a lot of advice. They had shut off all my friends, don't let them in the house. They were shutting every door because they knew the last door I would go to was the treatment door.
Yeah.
So they had to shut all. I'm going to go to the weakest link.
Yeah.
So there's the message. You got to shut every option down. And the only door, I believe, is jail for criminal behavior and then help. Because that's what I've seen in the last 25 years as the most effective way to deal with the people that we're seeing that are homeless in encampments on the streets.
Wow. Look, I mean, the term miracle gets thrown out a lot, and sometimes I think a little bit too generously, but not in your case. I mean, this is an incredible, and if you ever, hopefully I can get some time with you and dig into this more. It is a fascinating story. You're a brilliant man. Your insights into this are so, so sharp. I appreciate you opening up and kind of sharing with my audience as well, too. I really appreciate it, and thank you.
Well, like I've always said, Steve, we are better together. Whenever we're together, we're better.
That's right. Well, we're going to go do some radio this afternoon together, right?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
Good stuff. Wow. I hope everybody out there in the unlicensed counselor world got as much out of that as I did. It's one of these things I'm still getting used to interviewing everybody. And I've heard your story in great detail multiple times. I'm fascinated by it. And I just think there's so much that we could all learn. And then layer in your criminal justice knowledge and experience and what you're sharing, why we're not looking at that as kind of a nationwide type of thing. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more.
And remind me to come back on your show and tell you about me finding Fluffy the $50 lost cat.
Okay, I'll do that. And next time, bring a picture of the bush, too. I want to put that on social media. Wow, great stuff, everybody. Again, thank you so much, Jeff. Well, I hope you learned something today, folks, on the Unlicensed Counselor. This was such a treat to have our friend in studio and hopefully had some insights. I know that, not everyone knows someone that's homeless, but like Jeff said so eloquently, it was a long journey to kind of get there. And hopefully if you do have somebody in your life struggling with drugs or alcohol, maybe you can connect with them now to prevent that journey down the road. So that's all we've got. Hey, this is, I think, going to be the last episode before we close out the year. So I just want to say Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, all the good things that this year has brought to all of us. Thanks for listening to the Unlicensed Counselor. And until next time, thank you very much.